All right, so here we go, talking about inflation once again. So the big thing that's going to happen in this chapter is we're going to talk about the main causes of inflation that we see, the main things that drive inflation. We're going to see some of the costs of inflation, but some more will be covered in chapter 16, and we'll talk about inflation targeting to a certain extent. So inflation. What is inflation? Well, inflation's an overall increase in the price level in the economy, whereas deflation would be a fall, an overall decrease in the price level in the economy. So it's just pretty much the opposite. If you have negative inflation, you have deflation. The inflation rate, as we've talked about before, we've seen in different chapters. So in chapter 6, we learned how to calculate it using the CPI approach. Chapter 5, we saw the GDP deflator approach. And there's other ways of measuring inflation. These price indexes show that over the past 70 years, prices have risen on average about 4% per year. Okay, so you could see that we talked earlier on about like a general increase in the production or real GDP over the last 100 years. Now we're talking about a general increase in the price level. In combination together would be the general increase in the nominal GDP. But typically with inflation, one of the problems that we'll see over again, but I just want to get across, is when there's an increase in the general price level, decreases the value of money and has that problem of reducing purchasing power. So what are some of the theories that lead to this idea of inflation? Well, one of the first theories is this quantity theory of money equation, which is essentially you have all the things labeled out here. MV is equal to PY. And its velocity of money is hard for some people to grasp at first, but velocity of money is just the number of times each $10 bill, $20 bill switches hands in the economy. So if you imagine that in a certain year, there's 1,000 dollars that's being spent. Well, over the course of that year, there's if there was just a $10 bill, well, that $10 bill must have changed hands 100 times. So that's the whole idea of velocity of money. So if you think about it, if the amount of money that's in circulation is just that $10 bill times 100 times, well, this could have made $1,000 worth of purchases. That $1,000 worth of purchases could have been $20 products that were bought 50 times or whatever else. But these two have to equal out. So this is the situation that we have here. Historically, V is seen as relatively stable unless we have technological advancements such as credit cards or other things like that. V may change, but we'll see on the chart in a second that you could see that V is pretty stable. So we have M that changes on one side and then PY that changes on the other. PY you could see is kind of like our nominal GDP. So what will happen to MVPY if the money supply increases? Well, if the money supply increases, it's either because there's been an increase in the prices or it leads to an increase in the output. What would be required to have zero inflation? So zero inflation is that there would not be a price increase. So no price increase, it just stays the same. Well, the only way that can happen is if the increase in the money supply is equal to the same percentage increase in output in real GDP. So if output or real GDP is increasing by 3%, sorry, that should have been on the other side, 3%. Well, if there's a 3% increase in the money supply, in that case there, if V doesn't change, there will be no inflation. But if we have a 5% increase in money supply and only a 3% increase in GDP, well, then you must have some level of inflation. Okay, so if we look at this graph over the years from 68 till 2015, like I mentioned, V is pretty stable. It might have gone down a little bit with technological advancement, Otherwise, we could see this is one form of calculating the money stock, M2. The money supply has gone up, and at the same time, nominal GDP has gone up. But nominal GDP hasn't gone up as much. Nominal GDP, we have to remember, is that price level times the output. So if it was just the price level that was following, it would pretty much follow, but there's been some growth in GDP that happens over this time, so that's why it doesn't grow by as fast. A little bit like in the previous example, if we have money supply growing by 5%, but real GDP growing by 3%, the actual growth in the price level wouldn't be as high. Okay, so it just gives you an idea that they're linked. Just in case you see these words on a quiz or something, the classical dichotomy is just like classical theories, and it says that there's a separation between nominal and real variables. And then the one I really want to focus on in this class is this idea of monetary neutrality. If you ever hear of this, is essentially it's a proposition that changes in the money supply do not affect real variables. Therefore, meaning that we have a situation where if there's an increase in the money, we're not really going to lead to an increase in GDP because of this increase in money. In the previous example, if we had the same increase in money as GDP, we didn't have any inflation, but we can't really say that the increase in money is creating this increase in GDP. That's what the people that propose monetary neutrality would say. But we'll see when we're going through recessions around chapter 15 that it may be possible to use monetary policy to stimulate the economy and to get out of the recession. So monetary is not always neutral, but the people that say it's neutral, it's often they say it's neutral over the long term. We'll get back to that later on, but it's this whole idea that increasing the money supply will not just stimulate the economy and lead to more production. We'll see why and understand this a little bit more. So if you think about this inflation fairy example, while you slept, all the prices of the goods, labor, assets, everything doubled, even the amount of money in your wallet. If the prices of everything doubled overnight, what would happen? Take a second, think about it, pause the video. Not much would really happen. If the price of everything and every amount of money that's in circulation, wallets and everything else just doubled, doesn't really change anything. So that's just to give you an idea that inflation on its own may not be that bad, but we'll see who may be the losers in the next section. So here's just a link that shows here growth in money supply down here. So that, let's say this is 100%. Growth in inflation, still 100%. So most of the countries are pretty much along this green line, which means that most of the countries, typically if you grow money supply by a certain percentage, inflation will follow by the same percentage. So there's a quick link, because even if you think about it, we talked about like it's a mixture of growth in money supply and growth in price level leads to growth in price level or GDP. Well, countries that grow that are pretty advanced don't grow at that high of a rate, like just a few percentages. Countries that go up to the double digits are very rare, and it'll be around 10. And it's only those few countries that grow really rapidly, such as China did and other countries like that, but they don't really sustain that for that long. So you could think that if you're growing money supply by 100%, at least 90, there should be at least a 90% growth in the price level, just because GDP doesn't grow by 100% to balance it off. So we're going to talk about the idea of financing expenditures, because if you go back to this table here, some people could wonder, well, why are some countries just kind of like printing that much money, creating that much money? Well, what are the different measures, the different ways that the government could finance its expenditures? Think about it. Pause the video, think about it. What are the different ways that the government could finance its expenditures? Well, if you think of an industrialized country like Canada, easy way to finance your expenditure is all forms of taxes. Income taxes, sales taxes, municipal taxes. Those are the main way to finance expenditures by a government. Then the government could eventually borrow money in the form of bonds. That's the second way. But if you think that you're like a less developed country and have a lot of people that are not really have easy to track down, a very rural country, it might be very hard to tax them. And it might also be hard to borrow money from the population because the few people that have money in these poor countries put their money in another country that's more stable. If you're in Zimbabwe, I don't think you're lending money to the Zimbabwean government. So the third way is really to print money to pay for your spending. But this massive increase in the quantity of money leads to hyperinflation potentially, or just really high levels of inflation like we had earlier, like 100%. But if we just look at a bunch of examples here, Austria in the 20s, massive growth in the money supply, massive growth in the price level. It follows suit pretty much. Hungary, same thing. Germany, massive. Like you're thinking like in 21, something that would have cost $100 3 years later costs this number that is really just too massive to think about. Same thing with Poland. And what would happen quickly is that you want to go buy a loaf of bread and this is the amount of money that you have to carry. It's just insane to think about how inflation could really get out of hand if you're printing a lot of money. If you want to see how inflation could get out of hand, there's a bunch of videos on Zimbabwe and the inflation rates there. And over the last decade or so, it's been crazy. So take a look at it and see what's going on. But you'll see that the main cause of inflation is always this increase in the money supply. So next up, what are the different costs associated to inflation?